Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. So I'm Seth Marinello, as Corey said. This is my third year getting to speak at Level Design in a Day, and I didn't necessarily intend on being the first presentation when I came up with my title, but it seems to have worked out really well. So today we're going to be talking about a series of first steps. Specifically, we're going to be looking at strategies for sort of capturing your initial design and coming up with something that you can take back to your team and turn into a great piece of content. So we're going to be looking at sort of like everything from conception through sort of the block worlding phase, where I would say, all right, we've got a design, we've got something that we can move forward with. And now the idea for this presentation came from when we started doing the book project. I went back and started looking through our previous slides and looking at some of the stuff that I did in 2012. And I saw this slide in there. And you can see that, my main thing I was talking about was this dominant feature, having a central theme or idea that ties all the details of your content together. And I sort of said, well, after you're done with that, well, just block out the level around these objectives, right? Just because that's easy, right? And I started realizing, I haven't talked about some of this stuff before. Like, we just sort of skip over the beginning part and we talk about these high-level concepts of how we make good content, but how do you even get started in building anything, right? Anyone that's been involved in a creative process of whatever, you've dealt with this sort of blank page syndrome, where you have some days where you sit down and you're like, I know what I want to build. This is going to be great, right? And you just go. And those are the times when, you don't need to follow some sort of crazy process. But there's the other days where you're like, it'd be great if I could get anything on the screen, even if it's just some kind of like random boxes, right? I just want to get something up and feel like I've got some momentum. So we're going to be specifically sort of looking at, those days where you don't have forward motion of what you're trying to do. How do you get started, right? I think that if we're trying to create something and you're not sure how to begin, you need to define clearly what it is you're trying to build, what's success going to look like, and where are we trying to go. Specifically, the first thing you want to look at is what's your primary constraint, right? If you're trying to build a single-player game, like we're making a Dead Space title or something like that, ultimately you're responsible for producing a certain amount of duration of the main campaign, right? You need an hour worth of good content that's coming here. And this is sort of the primary thing that's going to drive you forward. If you have a more narrative-driven game, it could be that it's like we have two characters and we have to get them together, and this is the main point of this. If it's 20 minutes, if it's a half an hour, it doesn't matter as long as we deliver on this narrative moment. You're making a multiplayer map. It's like you have to have 64 players in this multiplayer map. And that's going to determine a lot of things about the size of the space, the number of capture points, and how much you can do with art, right? So there's always going to be kind of this short straw. And that's the thing that's going to determine a lot of the decisions you're going to make down the line. So if you can identify that up front, it helps build sort of this constraint box that you can work within and then create from there. Another thing that you can do is look at what are the things that every level is going to have in this game, right? If you're making a Mario level, a Doom level, a Dead Space level, whatever, you're going to probably have something like a start point, an end point, some enemies, some pickups. Like, what are the basic building blocks of your game that appear in 80% of all of your levels? And if you've got this, you're like, well, these are the things that have to be there, right? So if I don't know other things, I can at least start figuring out, well, where I'm going to put my suit store or my upgrade bench or my kiosk, right? We have general plans in our phase definitions that explicitly say, like, hey, as the LD sat down and thought about, like, walker locations, pickup locations, and things that are paced out through, interspersed with the combat and the other events. So these are some of the things that I just pulled out of some of our random documents for Dead Space 3. This is the stuff we've explicitly listed out. And you don't have to do this every single time you're building a level, but the first time you're working on something on a project, it's good to have this written down, right? Because you're like, these are the elements that I have to mix in along with everything else. Since we've got this, right, we've kind of got a general idea of what is it that I need to build. But then how do I start building it, right? Well, step one for building something is to capture the intent or capture your design, right? And what do I mean by this? I think that there are three main components to delivering a design if we're talking about making like a single player level. You've got a concept, which is just this high level sort of X statement thing or your dominant feature or whatever it's going to be. You've got a walkthrough, which is a description of what you want to build. And it doesn't have to literally be a walkthrough if you're making a multiplayer map or something. But it's a plan of, well, what's the setting of the map? What are the different sort of points going to be? How is everything going to work together? And what's the content going to really entail? And we'll go through each one of these sort of individually. And finally, there's a block world. All of this is the design. And that's the deliverable that we're trying to get to at the end of this. You want to have a thing that you're like, I'm a level designer and I've produced this thing and this is what we're going to go forward and build. It may not be the final design, but it is a design and it's the point from which you can launch forward. So going through each one of these individually. Concept. This is in some ways the simplest because it's just like, well, this is the main idea or the main thread that I'm trying to take through it. But it's also one of the hardest things to kind of lock down. In my 2012 talk, I was talking almost exclusively about coming up with a central concept. And I said, you know, sometimes you look at a level and you want to be able to say, well, this is the underwater level, or this is the nighttime stealth level, or this is like the at sea level. Something that's the central element to the art and to the gameplay and to the story that's going to pull it all together. An example that I wasn't able to use because we hadn't announced that we were doing Dead Space 3 at the time, but was like sitting in the front of my mind, was a level I was working on called Command Ship. So I had this idea that the whole idea was that you're awakening this sleeping ship. This is the first time that anyone's been on this abandoned ship in 200 years, and everything in it was like all the handles you had to manually operate. There was dust. There's necromorphs that are sort of hanging in cocoons that we hadn't done previously in the game. Just to sell this idea that there's kind of like this latent evil, and you're showing up and kind of like kicking it back to life, right? And that culminates in your sort of final like generator encounter and all this stuff tied into this central idea. And now, you know, this isn't something that just pops into your mind, though, out of nowhere. Like, we had this whole sort of underlying thread of kind of Mountain of Madness Cthulhu stuff going on really early in Dead Space 3. So that's sort of where this idea evolved out of. But you can't just assume that you're going to come up with your concept out of the blue, right? You have to brainstorm, find references, talk to other people. The amount of time that I spend just grabbing other designers and being like, hey, so I need to talk to you about this thing. Like, and it's just like, what if we did blah, 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 right? And we'll throw a bunch of ideas up on a board. And I have just folders and folders of random machines and things like that I've found on Google Image Search and Tumblr. I have no idea how people, I guess you just looked through books or whatever and add the little sticky notes to them in the olden days. But you have all these things that are going to inspire you, and you put together, and you can try to find threads that connect these different things that are exciting. And from there, your concept can grow of, I want to take it in this direction. And then you sift through that stuff, and the stuff that really resonates with the concept that you're trying to make, you distill down into a walkthrough. And now, what form it takes, it is going to depend on what kind of content you're trying to make, what kind of game you're trying to build. But I think that there's some core things that your walkthrough needs to answer, right? You need to have, what are your major objectives? What are the major things that the player's doing? What are the major beats? So what kind of things are we highlighting in the level? And these things are going to determine the scope of the level. You're going to get an idea of how many, custom gameplay scenarios do I need? Do I need custom texture sets? Things like that. This is the first time where we can start evaluating, like, well, what is it that you're really asking to build? But it can be kind of hard to parse all this information out of, 20 pages of me rambling about all these, like, scary corridors and stuff like that. So it's really important to include a top-down map in your walkthrough of whatever you're trying to build, because this condenses this whole scope concept down into one thing that you can look at, and it really captures the flow of the level. You can look at it with your eye and trace how the player is going to be moving through the space, and even start to evaluate things like, well, maybe I need some more space in between, this beat and that beat, right? Like, am I actually asking for the right amount of rooms? And this is all great, and you're really excited, and you're like, I've got this concept, I've got this pile of, fantastic reference, and you're checking it all into Perforce, and, who's going to read it? Like, you're going to read it, your producer's going to read it, and you're going to high five all day about how awesome it is, but half of the artists that are working on your level aren't necessarily going to see this. So I think that one thing that is important is once you feel like you've got some momentum behind what you're building, is to take it, and we do these boards where we'll get some key art, some key images, we'll have a story summary, the top-down map, and then because in Dead Space we're really worried about the lighting and the tone as you're progressing through the level, a color script of kind of like how we're going to make things. So if we have a major state change, like in Command Ship where you turn on the power, the second half is going to have a different feel. And that's mentioned in your walkthrough, and it's captured here so that, you've got a 100-person team They can all look at it. Now, if you're on a 5-person team, it's easy for you to just sit down and talk about these things, right? But if you've got someone that's building a desk for your, your admiral's quarters or something like that, you want them to be able to kind of get a general feel for what you're trying to put forth as a designer, right? And at this point, we've got this pretty board. We've got all this stuff. It's like, well, our design's done, right? And it's interesting because I was talking to our lead level designer from Dead Space 3 about this presentation. I'm like, yeah. And we had done this thing early on where we're like, we're going to plan out the whole game, what the general high-level beats are, and we're going to write really short, like a couple paragraph walkthroughs of what each level is going to contain, and then gave them out to the designers. And they would finish through the walkthrough, and it would get approved. And then they would start building the block world. And the approved walkthrough that everyone had agreed, yeah, this is what we're building, would differ insanely from the block world that would come back. And once we had the block world approved, the level didn't change that much. We were like, okay, we know what was going on. But it was obvious that there was major questions that weren't being answered by the earlier part of our process that needed to be sort of worked out in the block world. And the things that I think that we're missing so far in our process are we hadn't captured the look and feel of the space. Like you've got concept art and reference and things like that, but you don't know what it feels like to actually be there on the controller, standing in the space, and thinking about, well, how big is this room? How high is the ceiling? What are the sight lines, right, between this moment and that moment? Am I going to have a thing in my top-down map? You're just not necessarily thinking of, well, I'm coming into the room, and I've got the door that I need to go to, and it's on the left-hand side of the room in my top-down map, and you get there in the controller, and you realize that we're a third-person game with a character on the left-hand side of the screen, and the character covers the place that you're trying to go, right? You have to think about these things. The other thing is you've already got all the beats, and you know what the player flow is going to be, but how do they connect, right? In the first chapter of Dead Space 3, we had a moment where Isaac meets Danik, the bad guy, up on this balcony, right? And you've moved through the whole level in a continuous space. We haven't really had an opportunity to teleport the player or move them anywhere. And then Isaac falls off of this ledge and lands in this alley and has this whole encounter. And on a top-down map, it makes a certain degree of sense. But when you're sitting down and actually trying to build it in 3D, it's like, do I actually have enough rooms to get me from the public sector to here? Is a balcony going to make sense? Do I have a doorway that kind of opens into nothingness? Does this space actually work? And that's what building your block world is going to do. So now I guess the big thing is we got to build a block world. So step one is you sit down and you just make some boxes. At least this is sort of the strategy that I employ. You start off, get sort of some kind of central point that you're going to go from, and then I kind of grow the level from there. An example, another one from Dead Space 3, is the research ship. So this was my initial walkthrough top-down map for the level. And you'll see that there's this room in the middle of it called the connecting hallway upper. And there's a lower part, but this is because later I had to cut it into two things. Because I initially was like, hallways are easy, right? I'm just going to put in a hallway, and that'll be a point, and I'll just start growing it from there. And I start looking at it, and I'm like, well, but I want to have a window over here so that it connects the outside to the inside of the ship, because we could go in the exterior. I never built something like that before. And then I'm like, I want a pillar, because I want pillars and ducts in this level. And I'm defining what the look and the feel is, and the room started to grow. And from there, I was like, well, okay, well, now I know what this hallway that's connected to this thing is going to look like. And the whole level kind of grew out of this one central point. And if you open up most maps that I've worked on and you find the room that's at 0, in Maya, that's probably the first thing I started with. And sometimes it ends up being a really big room. Other times it's like a dead-end hallway, and it just grew from there. And, I was wondering, am I crazy? Is this kind of, am I the only one that does this? And there's this interesting article online by David Johnston, who worked on D-Dust. And it's a fascinating read, actually, because he's basically had this screenshot and one other screenshot from the early Team Fortress 2 version that Valve ended up canning. And he saw this and was like, oh, I see these elements. I like these arches. I like these textures. And he was like, I wonder if I could do this in Counter-Strike. And he basically built this room. And from that room, that ended up being the very bottom of this map which is the CT spawn point. And the rest of the map, he was just sort of filling in. And it's interesting as he's going, he's talking about how he tried adding in an underground section, but it didn't feel like right because it didn't have a lot of the architectural elements and the general vibe that the initial room did, and he ended up pulling it out. And when you've got something like that, you've got a piece where you're like, okay, this is capturing kind of the vision and the feel of the space that I want, that you can then judge other bits of content, then you know you've got it, like you're going forward. But as I'm looking at this, a thing sort of occurred to me of like, well, yeah, there's definitely other people that do this, but aren't I basically just advocating for following the WorldCraft tutorial? Like, aren't I basically saying, like, stick a brush in the world, hollow it out, dump it in info player start, and hope that you've configured all of your pack files correctly and it's actually going to build, right? Have I really not changed the process in which I build levels, you know, in the last, like, 15 years? And I went through a serious crisis about this because I was like, you know, have I been sort of just like limited to thinking about things in terms of like brushes and boxes? How am I going to break out of this, right? Because like when we were doing the hands earlier, is a lot of people now are, you know, you're either not making something that's like on a real tournament deathmatch level or like a Half-Life level or something like that, or you're working in an indie space where, you know, you're using a completely different kind of tool set than we're using in AAA. So it's like, well, how do I kind of break out of this box, right? Because I was looking at games that I found interesting online, and it's like, well, how am I going to turn a box into DayZ? Or how am I going to turn a box into you know, a city in GTA 5? Or how am I going to turn a box into a level for Cut the Rope, right? Like, what does all of this mean? And so I called up our creative director from Dead Space 2, who had moved on and was working at Zynga for a while, and I was like, hey man, so I'm working on this presentation about block worlding, and I'm worried that it might be like, you know, a little too locked in kind of like the work that, you know, that I've done, like kind of traditional level design of this sort of thinking about interiors and not necessarily thinking about like an exterior space where you're worried about the relationship of different points together, but more like defining the whole of the level. Like, how am I going to generalize this? He was like, oh, this, basically I feel like I've been building kind of D&D dungeon maps the whole time, right? And like, as soon as you get past the point where you're defining the edges of the dungeon, what are you going to do? And so his response was, well, I mean, if your presentation is really just about whiteboxing purely, then I think you're talking about a very specific kind of game and a very specific kind of tool set. So that's when I started to incorporate some more stuff about the general process and how we would integrate your design. But I also realized that maybe I needed to sort of like look at things beyond just what I do sort of in my day-to-day process. And I started asking people that work in other disciplines, well, you know, how do you get started on doing design stuff? Because I realized, you know, maybe if I want to expand beyond this, I need to get a new strategy. So I talked to some people that do like UX design. I was really interested in user stories and things like that for a little while, and I started reading a bunch of like IDEO papers and going crazy on design thinking for like about 2 weeks. And then I was like, I don't know, this might be getting a little far off base. It's maybe getting a little generalized, right? Because this is a level design talk, and as a level designer, you're often not creating the interface that you're using. You don't create the controls, you don't create how a lot of things feel. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, and I think that that's a whole nother talk, basically. I was just getting too far away from block worlding. But one thing I did find interesting was I was talking to my friend who's an architect in New York, and she does like condos and retail spaces and things like that. And I was like, well, how do you get started? And she said, well, she makes a few bubble diagrams. And, you know, I was interested in how focused she was on what the human or the user or the player was going to be doing at the time. But also just how they're thinking of, well, how do these spaces relate to each other and what does it imply? And so I was looking at some bubble diagrams. And some of them are very blueprint-like, but other ones are kind of abstract. And I think that's interesting about this is you can have a room that's got a kitchen, a dining room, and a living room all in the same space. And there's no walls separating them, right? But they'll have separate bubbles because the bubbles are representing the function or the intent or the purpose of a space. And you're thinking about how these relate to each other and how they connect. And this is sort of abstracting out, you know, things to a certain degree. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting, and it's spatial, and maybe this could go somewhere. At the same time, I did the Global Game Jam. And I'm building this game in Unity, and of course, I'm doing sort of the level content. And we're building this Joust-like game, right? So it's a single screen thing, and I have this terrible little drawing that was in my notebook of like my first version of like, well, what's our level going to be? And I remember that my thinking was, well, I don't want it to feel like, Mario Brothers Arcade, where it's just a bunch of boxes. I want it to feel like there's unique areas and unique spaces, and if I go to like this corner, I'm like, oh yeah, I like this place. And as I'm doing it, I've been thinking about bubble diagrams. I started realizing that I'm like, oh, well, in this corner, I'm going to have like a little diamond cave, and I want to have a nice little narrow thing in here, and a little something you can fall down. And I'm just thinking about these unique areas that are sort of like bubbles of purpose or bubbles of function. And the main thing that I'm doing as a level designer in this action is how do these things flow? How do they connect together? And I had this initial version of it, and you can see that I sort of expanded a few things, moved some things around. I moved my little diamond cave down to the bottom. But then in the final version, a lot of those core elements were there, right? And I even if I look at this, I just see like there's a central conflict point. There's some side areas where you can have pickups and things like that. And by creating these pockets of interest, we've kind of generalized the way that you're thinking about space and function. And you can use this for a single screen game, or if you were building like a city and you want to have different regions and then how you flow between them and when these things become accessible. I think that if you look at like designing a world in Metroid, designing like a multiplayer first-person shooter battle level or whatever, everything will work. But at the same time, you don't want to make everything too complex. You don't want to make everything unique, right? You want to make sure that each area has a purpose. And the player should have options, and that's why thinking about the flow between them is so important. Because you need to have options, but it can't be like you come into a room and it's 360 degrees and every single thing is a door, right? Because then the player's decision is just like, well, I don't know. It's a crapshoot. Really complex maps are hard to learn. This is something I learned really early on. I was really obsessed with like the crazy Counter-Strike maps where there's like a million ways to flank and vents and all that kind of stuff, and no one plays those. Everyone plays Dust and Office, right? And it's because it's an easy thing to learn, and you kind of have a meta game of, well, we go down this route or we go down this route, right? And if you go one way 5 times and then you go the other way once, right? And it becomes interesting. And single-player maps, if you get too confusing, the player kind of loses sight of what it is that they're trying to do. I found this as I was digging through some architecture stuff as well, and I think that this quote is kind of interesting because it ties in the idea that you're always thinking of things in the next larger context. And I think that thinking of these bubbles of function when you're planning out things really sort of enables this. And it ties in a lot with what I'd been talking about in my Building Universe Through Details talk, of having this kind of mosaic of narrative, of how there's a story to each fight, each room, each level, each game, and everything sort of fits within each other. And from there, I think that, you can come up with a design and you can vet it at each phase and make sure that you've got something. But once you've got that thing, it's like, well, is this design good, right? At a certain point, you have to sit down and evaluate. We've got all these things, and is this what we want to do? Is this where we want to grow from? I think that an important thing to keep in mind as you're going through all of this is that at any point, you need to be willing to go to step 1 if things aren't working, which is throw everything or anything away, right? You don't necessarily have to get rid of everything, but I used to be a computer engineer, and one of the things that one of my professors in undergrad taught us was that you write a function, and you run this function, and you're having problems all the time. It's like your center, it was really complicated and hard to do, and it's where all your bugs are coming from, right? And people are often scared to tackle that kind of stuff. But if you have a part of your design or your level it's just not working, you got to be willing to kind of throw it away because you've learned something, right? You've learned why it's not working. And once you've identified that problem, redoing it again is probably only going to take like 10% of the time it did the first time. And what you've got is going to be sort of leaner and cleaner and better. Ultimately, what we're trying to do, is create a finished product. And if you're pouring like metal or plaster into a mold or something like that, you're going to have this little thing called sprue, which is like the avenue which you're pouring the plaster into the mold. You have to cut off a little like nub at the end, right? And sometimes that's your initial design. It's something that you needed in order to get it done, but you just had to kind of cut it. I've had so many times where I've built a room, like this room was one of the ones I did in Dead Space 2, and like you can't see the exit. The enemies make no sense, and I have this like nonsensical ramp that goes down, only just to go back up again. And whenever I start doing that, I'm like, oh, I'm just trying to arbitrarily change the heights of the floors to make it more interesting. But then you sit down and you kind of come up with some central idea, like having a window separating you from what's going on. And this room right here, you can see, ended up becoming this in the final game. And that was because the block world captured enough of what I was sort of trying to do that we were able to go forward. Because ultimately, that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get a foothold. We're trying to take that first step to climb up this mountain of production. And it's only then that we're ready to move on to step 2 at last, which is to take that design and iterate upon it. And that's what Joel's going to talk about in a little bit. So I'm Seth. You can find me on Twitter at Seth Marinello, or email me at seth@alternatedreams.net. And I'm interested in whatever questions you guys have.
So if you guys have questions for Seth, you can go up to these microphones here, 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 and over there. And we have a few minutes.
What was the name of your Game Jam game?
The name of my Game Jam game was Wizard Wizards.
Go on.
There originally were supposed to be wizards, but they ended up being dragons. But you can't change things when you got 48 hours. It was a multiplayer kind of joust-like game, and you had magical powers that you could pick up different little hats. I don't know. I was really excited about having a wizard tower.
Speaking of not being able to change things, when's the line drawn to compromise where you can no longer change the level, it needs to be pushed off to the next step?
I mean, in an ideal world, never. But obviously not. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm emphasizing. And so what in the talk, I'm advocating for including the block world as part of the initial design phase. And I think a lot of the time you would, if someone was scheduling things out, they'd be like, well, they wrote a walkthrough, and we have key art, and we've got a concept, right? This level's done, check mark, right? Let's just ship it off and build it. And I really think that you need a playable block world that you can at least run around in before you can say, with any degree of confidence, like, I have a design that we could ship and build. So, I mean, that's the point where I'd say major changes to the level, like I'm going to, completely alter the flow, becomes out of the question once everyone's agreed that they've got a functional block world. But I think that gives you a good point to say, all right, everyone agrees that this is where we're going to go.
Can you go into a little bit of detail about starting like your 8th or 9th map, like once you've actually gone through a bunch of them and you feel like you've run your course, you're not sure where to go next, like now this is a brand new blank page?
I mean, I find that everyone is sort of unique, particularly if you're moving around games, right? If I'm building another Dead Space map, there's a certain element of, okay, all right, as I was talking about earlier, like I know that there's sort of a pattern or a rhythm to where you're going to have the combat and things like that. But that's just information that you're bringing in. I think that every single level is sort of a unique thing, and the only thing you do is get better with the tools over time, and you become slightly more experienced. But normally, I feel like the skills you gain are things like when things start going wrong. Like you're working on an encounter and people are confused about where things are, where the enemies are coming from and stuff like that. Those are the kind of problems that I feel like I spend the most time solving and feel like I'm getting better at. The beginning phase it's sort of just unique to every project.
When you're starting with a block world, what kind of level of detail do you start with? Like, do you place a block for every crate, or do you just kind of put a big block like this is just going to be a pile of crates? Like, what kind of level do you start with?
That's why I included some of those pictures of like what the sort of general finished block world would be like. So I'm not doing any texture or any detail or anything like that. I mean, I would say that until you have like a hallway or like a general room with nothing in it that feels good, like don't start adding anything to it. Like the smallest amount of detail possible to capture what you're trying to do is good, unless you're a good 3D artist, right? Like I'll sit there and I'll just thrash in Maya forever trying to make something look good. So I don't even try.
Did you find out at the end that even with the bubble diagram, you started with the central bubble,
Yes.
one bubble, and then creates the bubble around? Because that's, for example, my approach. That I don't have the central room, and then creating from the one central room, I have the one bubble, and creating all the bubbles around. Did you end with the same?
Well, I think what you're describing is sort of in line with how I build a lot of levels and what I was talking about earlier, of sort of starting from a central point and flowering out from that location. I'm not necessarily sure that the way that I would build something would tie into the way that I'm thinking about sort of this bubble concept, but I look at that as more of a way of encapsulating a bunch of function, like this is a town in my open world map, or this is an island in like Assassin's Creed 4 or something like that. And what you're thinking about is the relationship of that bubble to another bubble, right? How they connect, how they flow, or even if you're making a cut the rope level or something like that, where you place the stars and where you place your obstacles or whatever, they kind of create these little relationships or spaces that are going to define how the player thinks about that space and how they think about your piece of content. And that's sort of what I'm thinking at there.
Particularly in the first few steps of building a level like this, do you ever get the level designer's equivalent of writer's block, and how do you deal with it if you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what I was getting at the beginning of the talk about, if you really don't know what you do, you sit down and define, well, what does this content have to accomplish in order to be a success, and what are the basic elements that there's no way we're shipping this without getting? As I was sort of talking about, if I know that I have to have a room that has a suit kiosk in it, like maybe I just start building that room and fitting it into the thing just so I feel like I've got some sort of momentum. But again, it differs from like level to level. I've had times before where I've like gone back and just started like doing top-down maps in some like ancient game just to kind of get a feel for what I want to do and not even think about what it looks like.
I have seen there is for game these days about the level design. Some designer plan to like trick player to go to like a detour or to the dead end. When you decide, is that have like a criteria of the design that how long this world should take about time?
How long going down a dead end should take?
No, I mean, if you want like the player to go to the right way to go to the next level,
yeah.
But sometimes like you have to go to that way or maybe to the dead end, maybe to a detour. How long for one level should take, like the spaceship that you have?
I mean, this is going to vary drastically depending upon what kind of game you're trying to make, right? And even in something like in Dead Space, it's not even necessarily that one level needs to be a certain amount of length, but it's like, what do we want the player to accomplish, right? If it's a simple side mission and all we're trying to do is, I did one in Dead Space 3 where you're just trying to capture some extra munitions supplies before the bad guys get them, and it's an optional thing. That's like a 15-minute level because what you're doing isn't that big. You can tell that story pretty fast. Right? And I think that, again, it's whatever your primary constraint is that's going to determine the size and scope of your content ultimately. So in Dead Space, it's often narrative, right? In a multiplayer map, it would be the number of players or the game modes you want to support.
Earlier, you talked about beats.
Yeah.
And linking of beats. Can you elaborate?
So beats is one of those sort of weird words that I feel like is generically refers to some sort of event that's not just walking around. But in a level specifically, those are often the objective points when I complete an objective and then I move forward, or I have some sort of major notable encounter, right? So in command ship, you enter the ship, so that's a beat. Basically coming into the ship, entering into the space, and there's a scene. And then you receive an objective, which is, go find someone. Right? And the time in between there and that next beat, which is finding this person you're looking for, that's filled in with a bunch of gameplay, but kind of how those things connect. And beats that are really close to each other or where you get in these sort of like tricky situations of like.
So beats are verbs?
Yes.
Pretty much, okay.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, the parallels between level design and architectural design are really interesting. And I was wondering if your architecture friend was able to shed some light on the kind of like the psychology of space and volume and how much that comes into play in your early bubble diagrams and stuff.
Mm-hmm. I think it's there's a huge overlap in terms of like the science of it or like the psychology of it, but in terms of like the practical application of like architectural. Like, games are this weird pseudo-reality, right? Where everything is like extra big and the way that everything flows together is just very different. Like like this room right here wouldn't be unusual in a game, but in real life it's like this room is giant, right? And so sorting that out, I think, is the hardest thing for someone that's coming from architecture to put in. But the idea of basic forms and how you break up space and how you separate things like pillars and architectural supports are super important. And like looking through architecture books is like the best.
How do you balance this process with the level artist who's probably equally excited about making vistas and big rooms and things like that, and ensuring that both of you come together to create a really coherent design?
Could you repeat that?
Sorry, was that not coming out really clearly?
Yeah.
Sorry, how do you and your level artist work together through this process? Because they've probably got their own aspirations about what they want to achieve, and ensuring that you both come together to create something that's really coherent and therefore successful.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the ideal situation would be that after I've got maybe a really, really rough block world done in, that I then proceed and work like walking like hand in hand with my environment artist for all that. And that's actually one of the things that I was talking about, the brainstorming phase. At that phase, I'll pull in whoever's going to be my environment artist, my concept artist, or whoever's the writer for that area, and just throw ideas around with them and get that stuff down, right? Like, a lot of it is going to be dictated by the story and the gameplay, but how the level really flows and how you add visual interest at that look and feel stage, I think it's really important to work with. Anyone that you can collaborate with, do it, basically.
When your level design contains puzzles or puzzle elements, how do you represent those in your block world?
It depends on how important I think it's going to be to the architecture and the flow of the level. If it's a self-contained thing, like something that I walk up and engage with, and then I enter essentially another form of control, and then I'm going to pop out of, it'll just be some debug text and a switch, and like I need 3 by 3 meters over here probably for something. If it's a large environmental puzzle, you need to at least block it out in Maya or something so you can slide the different elements that are going to move around and be like, see, I'm going to be able to build this and it's going to make some sort of sense. Because if you're betting your hero room on this, fantastic contraption thing and you don't have it visually represented, yeah. But those I'll often treat as like its own project. We'll be like, we're going to have an epic puzzle. Like at the end of the Dead Space 3 DLC, we have this gigantic room that we basically did the whole thing, and then separately we're blocking that final like boss puzzle room. And that's generally how we'll do it, and it'll have its own kind of design docs and all that.
Okay. When you try to decide the intent of the level you are designing, you decided depending on the game features, or you decided on that the feeling you want the player to feel, or some others. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that?
I mean, in some ways this ties into the primary constraint, but it also ties into what kind of game you're trying to make, right? If I'm building a level for like a braid or a portal or something like that that's mechanics driven, like, then the mechanic is going to be what drives a lot of the content, and my X statement or my concept should be something about exploring the different permutations of that mechanic. In in Dead Space, we have got a few basic mechanics, but they generally are featured in every level. We may have a moment where we're like, well, we really want to focus on stasis, or we really want to focus on TK, but ultimately, it's a narrative and an experience-driven game, because the mechanics aren't what we're using to create kind of the mood and the atmosphere, which is what a lot of the franchise is about.
How often do you have the situation where you're told your level is too massive or too much of a strain on like system resources on a constrained system? And how do you avoid that in planning or deal with that?
Pretty much all the time. In the last week, our lead technical artist came up and was like, "Really? You want to do this rodeo show again?" Because I have a tendency, like I'm relatively technical, and I tend to be like, "No, we can do this. This will be fine." And then at the end of the day, it's like, yeah. So for that boss room at the end of the Dead Space Awakening thing, I was like, I'm gonna make the biggest room that's ever been in a Dead Space game, and I'm gonna include all these mechanics that I've personally never got to put in a level somewhere. And it was kind of a nightmare to ship, but I mean, that's the start. That's the part that's fun, though, right? Like, you got to pick your battles, though. Like when I'm doing something like that, I'm intentionally being like, all right, this is going to be a moment that I want people to remember and that I want to be like something that I'm like sort of proud that I've put together. You don't want to like make hallways that randomly have like transparent glass in them all over the place just to, you know, make your rendering engineer cry.
Okay, I had a question on, you said on purpose of areas in your level.
Yeah.
Is it a good design principle to say to have just an area in your level where just the only reason it's there is for the player to explore and has no other purpose?
Yeah.
But to look good?
I mean, it's part of building out your world. Like, it should have a purpose, but it doesn't have to be a required alpha path gameplay purpose, right? Like, it might have been last year or the year before. At some point, I talked about how somewhere in your game you need to have like one bathroom, right? Like just to fill out the fact that, you know, these are people and there's a bathroom somewhere, right? Like those are the kind of things that flesh out whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I think having, having little nooks or dead ends that the player's going to discover, and if they feel like they found something cool, then it enhances their experience. So I mean, I'd put as many like interesting little side paths as I can get on the environment art budget.
Thank you.
I think we got time for one more. Yeah.
My name's Ben. I'd like to point about always looking at the larger context of things.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how big a role do other levels play in the design of your level?
When I'm working on something on a sort of a day-to-day basis, not that much. I mean, unless I'm looking at, well, they've got a mechanic that I find really interesting. Like we had a decompression mechanic in Dead Space 2, which got repurposed for like a million different things in other levels, not always just decompression. So there's that element of it. But that's actually one of the reasons why when we were doing DS3, we started out at the beginning trying to look at things from a very high level, because we wanted to have this experience where there was sort of more open or hub-like moments, followed by a more linear section bridging you to kind of another hub. And at that point, that dictated a lot, because we had a vision for what the overall game flow was going to be, and that dictated what the flow of the individual levels were in relation to the other bits of content, right? It also just depends on how much your stuff flows together. You know, if you're making like Bioshock 1 or something where you can actually move and backtrack a lot, then it does matter a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's
cool. Nice job. All right. Thank you, Seth. That was great. So we've got a 15-minute break, and then Joel's talk, how we shipped Skyrim and Fallout 3 using iterative level design, except backwards. That will be in 15 minutes, so go hit the head, grab a drink, and come back 15 minutes. We'll pick it up promptly. Thank you. Hey, what's